What chaps, I'm Magical Mike and I'd like to ask and answer a few questions about the Ranger Elite specialization, the Untamed. Hopefully I can explain quickly what it does, how it does those things, and most importantly how it feels, and if it's fun to play. And if you like the video then do please leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Thanks. First up, let's see what ArenaNet thinks the Untamed is all about, and then I'll take it through some Dragon Response missions, strikes, and some open world mobs.
Ancient forces of nature dwell within Echovault, and the Untamed have learned to channel them through the bond they share with their pets. Their earth-shaking hammer blows keep enemies dazed and off balance, while their pets' attacks are bolstered by raw primal energy. The power of nature flows back and forth between the Untamed and their animal companion, empowering their killing blows.
Alright, we definitely need to clear up a lot of what was said there since no real details were initially explained. The Untamed gains the ability to use a hammer, the cantrip utility skill type, and a new F5 button, Unleash, which swaps nature energy between the ranger and the pet, granting it new pet skills. The Untamed is all about crowd control and disabling enemies, and then capitalizing on those disables to inflict much heavier hammer blows and pet attacks, depending on your unleashed state. The Untamed works together with its pets, gaining much greater access to the symbiosis and teamwork between all of your skills. Let's talk hammer. I was excited for this because I used to play tons of ranger builds in Guild Wars 1, many of which using non-ranger weapons, like the hammer. They've tried to recapture the feel of the old Bunny Thumper build in Guild Wars 2, and I think the idea could work well with some numerical tweaks. Firstly, the hammer has two sets of skills depending on your unleashed state. When the pet is unleashed, the hammer skills focus mostly on debilitation and setup, and when you're unleashed, they focus mostly on payoff and damage. When, leashed, I guess, hammer 2 is a cripple, 3 is a double daze, skill 4 is a triple hit shockwave that immobilizes, and 5 is a huge knockdown AoE and a blast finisher. When unleashed, skill 2 gains more damage on disabled foes, hammer 3 becomes a double blind, 4's shockwaves gain much more damage to disabled and conditioned enemies, and hammer 5 is still a blast finisher, but now does more damage and gives might and fury, which is a bit of an odd choice, but I suppose it works well with the moment of clarity trait in marksmanship. Interestingly, none of these skills give the pet a buff, which is a staple for normal ranger weapons. On Greatsword, for example, Maul gives the pet an attack of opportunity for more damage, whereas there's just nothing like that on the hammer. Also fairly interesting that the hammer is the only weapon that benefits from having two skill sets on the Untamed. Unleashing with a Greatsword, for example, won't give you any new skills to use. I quite like the dual purpose of the hammer, but it's almost as if they needed to give it 10 skills and couldn't fit all that they wanted to into just 5. It is fun to play with though, it doesn't feel as slow as Warrior or Guardian hammer skills do. And we'll talk more about the hammer when we have the whole picture, because the class needs a lot of info to tie it together. So on to utilities, we have cantrips. Your heal makes you unkillable for a few seconds and then drains your pet's health as a percentage to heal you. I literally never use this because it's very obviously inferior to Troll Unguent and we heal as one. Not really sure about this skill. The counterplay could be fun in PvP, but in most situations the pet is taking cleave damage anyway, and if not, then you don't really want it to sacrifice its own health in the first place. The Elite gives you a ton of defensive boons and reduces all your incoming damage by 50%, which is massive. All your strikes also reduce the cooldown of this skill while it's active, making this a crazy tanky skill to have access to. I imagine it'll be better in PvP settings though, because Strength of the Pack exists and is probably a better PvE pick for damage, and you get the stability on that anyway. The regular utility skills were a little bit more interesting to me though, minus mutate conditions, which simply turns all of your condis into vulnerability. It's boring, I never used it, but it could see use with the Adept trait that removes a condition when you use Unleash, which is on a short cooldown, which, you know, you can combine those two things and get a nice condi cleanse, I guess. Unnatural Traversal is a shadow step for you and the pet that has half cooldown if you hit a target. You do need a target in the first place, but this is a good chase skill and a very good one for ambushing people too. Exploding Spores is a ring of delayed explosions. These do a fair bit of good damage, and a knockdown if all of the spores hit the same target, which makes it a great setup skill and I enjoyed using it, and Nature's Binding, which creates cages on nearby enemies that knock them over if they try to walk through those vines. Again, this is another good setup skill that could be used for some untamed traits, but I just liked it for the fun new crowd control it offered. Again, another good PvP skill to trap someone in those death rings. As for the profession mechanic, what is unleashing anyway? Well, firstly, we gain access to all pet skills on our F buttons. This is nice for anyone that ever wanted more control of their pets, especially nice to be able to control when a pet uses its crowd control skills. Did you know, for example, that boars have an AoE 3-second knockdown charge skill? Probably not. But when you unleash, you swap the state between you and the pet, on a very generous 10-second cooldown. When you're unleashed, you do more damage, but also take more damage, so watch out for that. It'll also swap your hammer skills if you happen to be using it, and various traits interact with it too. When you pass it over to your pet, you do less than normal damage, but also take less than normal damage. The pet, however, doesn't receive any of these buffs and changes, which I find quite odd. What it does get are 3 new unleashed pet skills. F1 shadow steps it to its target, this does have a max range by the way, and it poisons disabled foes. F2 removes boons and slows disabled foes, and F3 makes the pet emit a projectile destruction cloud as a poison field, which also chills disabled foes. It can't attack while this animation plays though. You'll also notice that all the pets get the same unleashed skills, and none of these count as beast skills for the purpose of Beastmaster traits, which is a shame for the Beastmaster synergies. And now you know that the unleashed pet gains bonuses to hitting disabled foes, the hammer gains disables, and the opposite happens when the Ranger unleashes. You see how the symbiosis of the Untamed is supposed to work. One of you sets them up with a disable, and then the other capitalizes on that for bonus effects. It sounds simple, but it's actually surprisingly tricky to get your head around controlling the pet skills in each state, your skills in each state, and creating those combinations on the fly. Traits, I don't think, were all that inspired. They don't really give the Untamed a good sense of identity beyond disable stuff for bonuses. You can augment the pet skills a little, giving F1 a blind or F2 a corrupt instead of a boon rip. You can also get on-swap effects for unleashing, some boons, some Condi cleanse, There's a Grand Master that heals you for doing damage, which is alright for sustain, and there's another that stacks movement speed and damage on strikes for you and your pet, which is probably nice for chasing enemies down. However, the real interesting stuff is on disable effects. You can get quickness or stability on disables based on which of you is unleashed. This turns out to be a lot of quickness by the way, and probably a lot of stability, but I didn't really notice that much. You apply vuln or weakness, and for the big GM trait, every disable you land reduces cooldowns of all equipped skills by 4 seconds each, with a tiny little quarter-second eternal cooldown on it. This is a huge trait. It was the only choice to me, and I hardly touched the others because of it. Hammer alone has 3 disables on it. Remember that leash skill 3 is a double daze, counting for a whopping 8-second cooldown reduction if you manage to land both hits. Unfortunately, pet skills that disable foes do not seem to trigger this trait, which was a shame. It'd be nice if they did, and it would add to the teamwork if they did, so please internet, make that change. It's worth noting that this trait reduces cooldowns on all equipped skills. Pet skills, utilities, elite skill, weapon skills, your other weapon skills, and the Unleash F5 skill itself, allowing you to do some very complex combination attacks. Indeed, we have a great many Ranger traits that can take advantage of disabling enemies, and cooldown reduction gained from that trait. For what it's worth, much like Warrior, Ranger trait lines are all pretty good and offer some interesting ideas to combine with the Untamed disables. My favourite lines were Skirmishing and Marksmanship, and though I did use Beastmaster in pretty much all of my builds, I would say that Skirmishing and Marksmanship could be combined together for some insane damage. Probably. I just never tried it. Skirmishing offers swiftness and fury when swapping weapons, which will do quite a lot, plus extra damage and crit while flanking. It'll also give you vigour and quickness on evades, and while you could use a sword here, I opted to just use axes instead on the skirmishing build. The big ticket item is Quick Draw though, allowing you to swap to hammer and throw out 5 disables in a matter of moments, with 4 of those coming from a double hammer 3. Combo this further with the Exploding Spores skill, Spike Trap or Nature's Binding, and you can considerably chunk your cooldowns every time you swap to hammer. You'll also find that you can swap into hammer while unleashed, pet CC, nail a hammer 5, swap your unleash, double CC with hammer 3 while hitting a big pet skill, instantly unleash again and then slam down with a hammer 4 or 2 for a big follow-up damage. There's tons of combinations just like that, and they're pretty hard to pull off with the speed of combat flow in this game. I comboed this with axes because Path of Scars is a massive crowd control pull that, if thrown far enough, can go on cooldown before the pull happens, reducing the cooldown to a neat 8 seconds. You can also double up on quick drawn whirling defences or Winter's Bites for even bigger damage too. The amount of quickness that this build gets is absolutely crazy, and with certain pets benefiting from that boon, Quickening Zephyr and We Heal as One sharing boons between you and the pet, you'll see some wicked fast smoke scales and wyverns running around. Do be aware that some pets can't currently hit moving targets though, and some can't actually use quickness, as their animations are weird. Wyverns though are still good, so expect to see those quite a bit. The marksmanship variant that I used a greatsword instead of axes. Same principles, going for the CC and cooldown reduction stuff, but this time with burst damage and opening strikes. This build goes for pet swapping to gain more fury, might, swiftness, weakness and quickness, and then applies Sikkim for regen and bigger pet DPS, and We Heal as One to share the boons back to you. You'll see a lot more vulnerability on this build, but more importantly, anytime you disable, you'll see loads of boons, cooldowns and huge crits on your greatsword mauls more often. Both of these builds can spam their heal skills too, since the Fervent Force trait reduces the cooldown on that, meaning tons of pet boon share. I also concepted a condition variant with the shortbow and axe torch, which essentially use the same disables become cooldown reduction idea to spam things like Spike Trap, Entangle and Sharpening Stone for absolutely loads of stacks applied in a short time. A bristleback or an Iboga pet would further lay down the hurt, making anybody caught in that mess very, very sad. I get the impression that the Untamed is more of a PvP elite spec than anything else, which might be unfair to say, but I'm not really sure. The damage reduction when not unleashed is kind of a big downside, and the incoming damage increase when you are is another. A lot of the abilities that you have are about chasing targets, shadow steps for the pet, disables, teamwork and allowing you to follow up and play with combo duo attacks with an AI partner. Giving you more access to pet skill cooldowns and control over them seems good in theory, but in practice you just want to spam a lot of the normal pet skills, like Drake Chomps or various kicks or bites that they have. The pets do nothing without being told to now, which is great for not wasting important disables, but that's about it. You also lose access to attack my target and return to me keybinds, which is awkward and left me wanting, but maybe they'll bring them back in the future. Against various enemies in the open world, I found myself feeling very squishy and relying entirely on a bunch of defensive tricks to keep myself alive, dodging much more than I normally would, using the pet to tank, spamming CC to reduce heal skill cooldowns and buy me more time. On the plus side, it did make the elite more useful, but it didn't feel great. The class is very capable of making break bars dissolve though. The Untamed is pretty good at dealing with those, but it takes a lot of muscle memory and quick, instant situational thinking to determine what skills you have available at any one time, because this changes constantly. Saying that though, it is still a ranger, so it is very survivable if you pay attention, and it was mostly fine. I think what was really tripping me up was just trying to do everything all at once and showcase the whole class. Taking it more slowly might be a better idea overall. In DRMs, it was really pretty good actually, being able to remove boons from the challenge mode mobs with the pet unleashed F2, then being able to mass crowd control things and clean up. I did however struggle massively with the Snowden and the Thunderhead Keep bosses, both of which require a lot of damage in short periods of time where it's safe to do so. Thunderhead's Destroyer was a little too tough to kill the eggs, with the wonky pet AI not helping me, my minus 10% damage when not unleashed, and then needing to gap close the boss and get damage in before that repeated. To the Untamed credit though, Snowden's boss is mainly hard for the amount of break bars that you need to deal with, and with the many skill combos that you can pull off, I always had enough disables to break them, provided I didn't get confused and fumble my keybinds. As for strikes and group play, I don't really have much to say. I feel like my DPS was much lower than I could pull off on a Soul Beast build, and having access to the Unleashed Hammer and more pet skills didn't really help out a lot. I feel like it did fine, but nothing particularly special in a group boss setting. A lot of the synergies that you can gain from traits are pretty much just boons, which are likely handled already in a group setting. I'm not sure that the Untamed managed to pull off anything particularly useful, though if there's ever a boss that runs away or has more common break bars so you can take advantage of the extra damage to disabled foes, it'll shine. Mind you, Scrapper can also solve that problem with super speed and its own hammer CC. So, In conclusion, I'm not entirely sure what to make of the Untamed. I'm not really confident on where it fits in a group role, nor am I totally convinced it'll be unique enough to run it over a Soul Beast. It was ultimately fun to play, which is important to note, but it all hinges on the Fervent Force trait for me. And yeah, it has loads of crowd control, but the cost is really high. You're almost forced to use the hammer, the pet loses all of its autonomy while keeping all of the downsides of being AI controlled, and I'm quite sure that the trait that made a lot of these builds more fun to use will probably take some real nerfs before this comes out. Trying to do everything the spec can do all at once is very difficult to juggle, since everything is dependent on specific conditions to be met, and you dynamically change your access to those things constantly. Hammer CCs into unleash into hammer damage, then combo a pet CC into more hammer damage, then unleash the pet into a weapon swap, CC, and then unleashed pet skill, then you can pet swap into other pet CCs, and you can see it's already got very complicated. And every time you want to go through a rotation like that, things are going to change because not all of the cooldowns are going to line up. So yeah, it gets complicated. A little too complicated for me personally, so I ended up camping in one state or the other for longer periods of time, just essentially wasting the potential of the unleash mechanic. It's playable like that, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking for that kind of playstyle, then you should probably just use the Soul Beast instead. Keep an eye on the Untamed. This is one of those elite specs that I expect we haven't really unlocked the whole potential of yet, and I think is most likely to see some changes.